So whenever I wanted to learn something new, I would create this massively complicated plan that covered a lot of bases and had the goal of being like, okay, I want to be, let's say, be fluent. I want to be there. But often I didn't finish that. I never really stuck to the plan that I wanted to do. And it turns out simpler is so much better, and to the point where it's embarrassing. Here's what I mean by that. So I remember when I was a kid, I wanted to make this like super portable mini computer, sort of like a phone, but like I could code on it. And obviously nowadays you could do that. But I didn't really know electrical engineering. But it was like this really ambitious idea because back then I was really obsessed with learning how to code. When I was in middle school, before it got really popular, and I had these big visions, and there were so many parts of things. Like I had to learn how to do electronics, I had to learn how to code, I had to learn how to make a whole freaking OS, for crying out loud. And if I remember correctly, I remember having to think about every single detail and be like, okay, I should cover all of the details that I need to do for this project, and then I'll start. But if I'm being completely honest, all of that was the reason I stopped and why I never actually followed through with said thing in the first place. This can also be applied to everything like content creation, to game development. It's very wide encompassing, I can say. But at least from my memory, every time that I did this plan where I had to cover all my bases, like, okay, how do I, for example, for language, how do I think about speaking? How do I think about listening? How do I get better at understanding the words people are saying, or what the show is saying that I'm watching, let's say One Piece or whatever anime I was into at the time. And like, okay, now I need to cover writing as well, and then I also need to be able to talk with people, so I should go to language exchanges so I can work on my speaking skills. And that kind of plan is what would stop me, because granted, if you're trying to think about all four different things, like speaking, writing, listening, and reading, it's a lot of stuff, and you almost just kind of burn yourself out from doing anything at all to begin with, which is exactly what I went through. And before I could even get the ball rolling, whether that was right at the start or like a week later or even a month later, it just would kill the momentum before I even got anywhere, before the snowball even got rolling. And it's not a bad thing to have ambitious goals. I don't think that is the case, because otherwise we wouldn't have things like Microsoft or Apple or any of the companies that exist today. But in a 1 in a million sort of thing, especially when I don't have all the skills in place, not being able to follow through was my downfall, I think. And I guess this also ties into like not having lofty goals, at least for me personally, because I find that I tend to overblow it as a result. But especially after having watched content creators like Ali Abdaal with productivity and the idea of making systems, and I feel like that's a very prevalent idea on YouTube now, to think in systems. But I did realize that in order for me to get anywhere, it couldn't be lofty, or at least lofty was the secondary thing to my goals. Basically, the system needed to be something I could actually stick to, not some complicated thing that required like 2 hours of my day to actually sustain, and all it would take is one small thing to make it impossible. Like, for example, it could be a family emergency, which could be the worst case scenario, or I could just be really tired that day. Something really, really benign comparatively could be all what stood between me and sticking with my system or goal or whatever convoluted plan I had. And so instead of thinking about all the stuff that I should do, or what would be the most optimal scenario, especially when it comes to like languages, for instance, is instead of trying to cover all my bases, just show up, find something to show up that will keep me hooked on doing the thing. Pick a specific task, how you're going to do it, and whether or not it's going to be sustainable, and whether or not you can execute it. And of course, like for me, using AI, especially for game dev, has helped me sort of organize all of my thoughts and also help me sort of structure a plan. But even with game dev, despite the lofty goal, I still want to only think about what is the next thing I'm doing and making that list ahead of time, so I don't have to make those decisions way in advance, and so it creates a lot less friction when I'm working on game dev. And it's kind of focused more on the actionable things that you should be doing, I guess. But like having all of the gist of my idea outlined beforehand and only needing to focus on, okay, how do I implement this, is so freeing. Of course, I still deviate. I obviously don't want to leave my idea all up to AI, and frankly, that's just boring as heck. But there is flexibility in structure. The irony of the two being structure and flexibility, not necessarily being opposites, but kind of two sides of the same coin. And like, for example, sometimes I'll be like, okay, this feature is kind of really hard to implement and may just not really add that much to the game, so I'll just remove it because it won't make sense. I can freely add and remove stuff whenever I feel like it, whenever it makes the most sense, and whether or not it really adds to my own creative vision. It's not something that restricts me, I guess is what I'm saying. And even with language learning, like I've switched between like Link and Duolingo and Pimsleur and all sorts of different things. I've taken classes in Japan, I've taken tutor lessons, I've gone to language exchanges, I've done a lot of it. But I think especially when it's something where I learn languages because I like watching shows and specifically interacting with my family and close ones and people around me, it makes more sense if I focus more on like the speaking and just the stuff that is consumption. And plus, it fits my life. Pimsleur basically fits my life because I am always commuting back and forth between New Jersey and New York a few times every week. So it means that I can spend the car ride, which doesn't need my ears necessarily, to actually listen to the audio and actually get it done. And frankly, it's a lot easier to do audio when you're not constantly thinking about what you have to do today and just driving. But I guess the takeaway in that sense is finding a way, not necessarily efficiently, but how can you fit it in your own life? And it all stems back to sustainability and being able to execute. Because if you can't show up to a plan that's super difficult and you give up on the first week versus a plan that's simple, maybe take you longer, but actually gets there eventually, like there's a big difference. One actually gets there eventually, while the other, while it's efficient, never gets there. And also that just looks different for all sorts of people, so I can't really give a concrete like, oh, you should do this, you should do that. You know yourself best. But I do think a good takeaway is not to overcomplicate it, because sometimes the simplest ones, the simple plans, are honestly better. And I feel like that's proven throughout like history. Just simple tends to end up being a lot better than complicated. And it's really easy to complicate things. But also be flexible, because life is very whirlwindy, it's very all over the place. And I'm not also saying that you should not have a plan, because a plan does actually help you stay sort of on track. It's just a guide point. It's not supposed to be one size fits all, only follow this path or you'll die kind of thing. And especially in the creative space, like anything can happen. You know, I'm still figuring this all out, trying, because even nowadays I still get caught up in plans. But I do try to at least pull myself out of it when I can. But at the very least, I am moving. I am definitely at least making progress finally, and that makes me very happy. But yeah, that's all I have to say today. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.